Hello everybody who follows RTO Doctor Facebook page, and welcome to another evening of 30 Days, 30 Tips, in our second series. And tonight's going to be a very quick and simple quick tip, for the simple reason it's getting quite late, and as you can see I'm looking quite tired. It's been a very long day. But what I wanted to do was give you a quick tip about CRICOS policies and procedures. And the reason for this is I was taking a quick look at the PRISMS website this afternoon. PRISMS, of course, is the database that is used between CRICOS providers, the Department of Education and the Department of Immigration, Border Protection, Immigration. It's also used by education agents and other people for the issuance of confirmations of enrolment for international students or prospective international students who wish to study in Australia on a student visa. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this to your attention today is because sometimes the government, in their desire to facilitate compliance for providers, issue suggested documents such as the user guide for the standards or the National Code Explanatory Guide. And in this case on PRISMS, there is a procedures guide, procedures required guide it's called. And if you have a quick look, it's like this. I'm not sure if you can see that there, but it's easily downloadable from the PRISMS website, and it's called ESOS Compliance Quick Reference Guide, Procedures Required. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this particular document to your attention is because it's very brief, and what it suggests is that these are the only procedures that are required if you actually wish to be a CRICOS provider in Australia. So for those of you who can't see it, I'm just going to quickly run through the procedures that this document, and it's signed off by the government, says that you require. Now, there is a disclaimer on here. It says, this quick reference guide, the guide has been developed by the Australian Government Department of Education and Training. Information contained in the guide is designed to assist providers to comply with their obligations under the ESOS Act. It is not intended as a standalone document and should be read in conjunction with the ESOS Act, the National Code, the ESOS regulations and legislative instruments. Direct links to the legislation can be found at, and it's a website. Information in the guide should not be relied on as legal advice or a substitute for legal advice. Providers should seek independent legal advice as appropriate. So it's interesting with such a disclaimer that the document is actually called Procedures Required, and it's been issued by the Department of Education and Training. However, if we look a little bit closer, it says registered providers must have and implement procedures for. It sounds a bit like a directive to me, but anyway, let's have a look. It says assessing student qualifications, experience and English language proficiency, processing refund claims, monitoring activities of education agents, checking the suitability of a student's accommodation support welfare arrangements, managing critical incidents, assessing transfer requests, handling complaints and appeals, monitoring a student's progress and workload, monitoring, recording and assessing the course progress of each student, monitoring student attendance, granting and recording course credit, assessing, approving and recording a deferment of the start of study or suspension of study, ensuring its staffing resources are adequate and have the capabilities as required by the quality assurance framework applying to the course, ensuring that it confirms in writing with its accepted students at least every 6 months about their contact details and updates the records accordingly. Now, if we were to rely solely on this document as the CRICOS procedures that are required to maintain compliance with the ESOS framework, I think we'd have a hard time passing an ESOS audit with ASQA or any regulator for that matter. Because I personally, and I would encourage you to take a closer look at this, I would personally argue that you also need policies and procedures around work-based training. And yes, while this is covered under your standard RTO registration, there are also specific requirements around work-based training that apply for international students on a student visa. Same with partnerships. It may be covered in your domestic student registration. However, there are specific requirements around partnerships in relation to the ESOS framework that need to be addressed. You also should have a policy and procedure around capacity management and various locations where you offer qualifications and courses. You might also have a policy and procedure around course duration and the volume of learning and how that is addressed from a CRICOS perspective. We don't necessarily also have policies and procedures around course duration and volume of learning for domestic students, but maybe that is something that will help domestic providers address the volume of learning issue that is coming up so frequently in audits from all regulators. If we had a policy statement that guided us in what we're expecting to see for a course duration and how we're addressing the volume of learning, it may be an easier way of our trainers and assessors and our course writers to meet the requirements of the quality assurance framework. There should also be a policy and procedure around issuing COEs. You would have noticed in this document, the Quick Reference Guide for Procedures Required, that it closely linked to the standards of the National Code. And when it came to Standard 13, it talked about deferral and suspension, but it did not talk about cancellation of enrolment. And so I would challenge anyone to tell me that as a CRICOS provider, you don't need a policy and procedure around the cancellation of enrolment. In relation to Standard 6, all it had to say was managing critical incidents, but we all know that there is so much more to the compliance with Standard 6, such as orientation and making sure that staff and students are aware of what their rights and responsibilities are, their legal obligations under the ESOS framework. We also need to make sure under Standard 6 of the National Code that we have sufficient support staff. While there is no specified ratio anywhere documented in the domestic or ESOS framework, it is becoming more and more frequent for regulators, particularly ASQA, to identify that a provider does not have a sufficient ratio of students to staff, or staff to students, I should say, other way around. But it's quite complex that they suggest such a thing because nowhere is it documented what a sufficient ratio is. One thing that I also would like to recommend, and it's not just for CRICOS providers but also for domestic providers, what we're seeing a lot of at the moment are domestic providers who are unwittingly enrolling international students who are on a student visa, and they're not identifying themselves as international students on a student visa. And the RTO is not picking them up, and the RTOs are now being identified by ASQA through their through the due diligence of ASQA, for example, and the use of PRISMs. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this 30 Days, 30 Tips, one of the things that PRISMs is a database that is used between the Department of Education, Immigration and the provider. The provider inputs all the data in relation to international students, and all regulatory authorities have access to a significant amount of data that the provider doesn't see. So it allows effectively an international student to be monitored by all regulators in the background at any particular time. So if a regulator has a suspicion that a student that they're auditing in your RTO may be an international student on a student visa, all they need to do is take the student's name and date of birth, for example, and do a search in the back end of PRISMs, and if that student's details come up, all of a sudden it's identified without you even knowing that the student is an international student on a student visa in Australia, and if you're not a CRICOS provider, you are not eligible to have that student enrolled with you. Now again, this is becoming more and more prevalent across Australia amongst a large number of providers. It's been going on for at least 12 months that the regulators have been identifying this sort of thing, and they are issuing sanctions around cancellation immediately, or give us a reason not to cancel your registration for breaches of the ESOS Act when you're not a CRICOS provider. So I would encourage all of you domestic providers who are not CRICOS registered to ensure that your admissions processes allow you to identify whether or not a student is an international student on a student visa or a prospective international student on a student visa. It's not sufficient to just have the student identify or self-identify as an international student. You actually have to do your own due diligence checks as well. One of the greatest ways of being able to do that is to register with VIVO, Visa Entitlement Verification Online, and I'll put a link to VIVO in the comments section of this particular 30 days, 30 tips, but that's one way of ensuring that you are making sure that the student is actually eligible for enrolment in your RTO. So that's it for today's 30 days, 30 tips. I hope that that's helpful for some of you. Don't forget, it's not always best to rely on government released information about what you should and shouldn't do. And just a quick reminder on that note as well, that the user's guide to the standards for RTOs 2015 is just a guide. It's not a Bible, and it should not be relied on as this is what you need to do to be compliant. We often see clients who say, but I relied on the user's guide, and because I did this A, B, C, D, I thought that it would be okay, and it's actually not, because it's open to interpretation. It actually says in the guide at the very beginning that it should not be relied upon, just as this particular document did here tonight. So once again, please be careful with anything that's issued by the government and saying this is a document that you should rely on to maintain compliance. Please make sure that you have sufficient policies and procedures to ensure compliance with the regulatory requirements that apply to your registration, and don't rely on anybody to tell you anything different if you know that you need something. So for example, if you only had those procedures that are listed in this document issued by the Department of Education on the PRISM's website, you'd find yourself in a lot of strife. Thank you once again. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night for another 30 days, 30 tips, and good night.